Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and I'm here this week with Henry.
Hi.
And today, Henry, show the people who we're doing.
George Washington.
And what number president was he, Henry?
The first president.
That's right, the first president of the United States, George Washington. Some of you might be saying, but wait a minute, didn't you used to have a George Washington video on your channel?
Yes, we did.
Yeah, we did, that's right. It was actually like the second or third video we ever did, right? Mm-hmm. But the problem was, first and foremost, there was some really bad misinformation that I was given at Mount Vernon, believe it or not, about George Washington's relationship with slavery. So, I wanted to fix that and correct that and just do a brand new video for you guys. Plus,
the thumbnail was
yeah, that's
different.
right. The thumbnail was different.
Where was he buried?
That's right. The thumbnail of George Washington, the old video said, where was he buried? It wasn't a little cartoon head like you guys are used to on the thumbnails. So we figured, let's just do it over again, right?
Do it over.
So this is a revised, revamped edition of our very first presidential series installment, taking a look at the man behind us, the first president of the United States, George Washington. All right. So before we get into George Washington, though, and tell you some awesome things about him, what do they have to do, Henry? Tell them.
Hit subscribe down below, leave all your comments and questions, give a thumbs up, and leave a like.
Perfect. Hit subscribe down below.
Hit the bell.
That's right. Leave those comments and questions. Give us a thumbs up and a like. And yes, hit that what? Little notification bell so you can be notified when we do release new videos, which even moving forward is still going to be every single week. So now sit back and relax because we're going to take a look at the first president of the United States, one of our founding fathers, George Washington. And this is
Dead History.
Dead History. Hey guys, TJ back with you, and I'm here with the Hershey's man, Henry.
Hi.
And today we're taking a look at who, Henry?
George Washington.
That's right,
the guy behind us.
The guy behind us, George Washington. We got some awesome things to tell you about George Washington, such as he was a hero in the Revolutionary War, of course, the American Revolution. He was a war hero. Beside that, some fun things to tell you that, you may have thought were true your whole life or for many years, but are not true, such as, what were his teeth made out of, Henry? Do you know?
No.
A lot of people think they were made out of wood, that he had wooden teeth. That's not true.
Nope.
His teeth were actually made out of animal ivory, and unfortunately, out of the teeth of enslaved people that George Washington owned. So, we're going to get into all that and tell you all about it. Plus, of course, that famous story about George Washington with the axe, and he chops down a what?
A cherry tree.
A cherry tree, right?
That is fake.
That is fake, that's right. The whole, I cannot tell a lie. That whole story never happened. It actually came out after he was already dead. So, again, we're going to get into that and tell you all these fun, fascinating things. So they did the likes, they did the subscribes, they did everything they need to do. Henry, come on, let them know what they got to do.
Get the popcorn, the pretzels, and the soda, and whatever you want.
Chips.
Potato chips.
What else? I mean, the Ghostbuster cereal, right? Yeah. So get out whatever you like to snack on. Because we're going to take a look at the man behind us, George Washington, our first president of the United States. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to this very special revised edition of our George Washington video. I am here today with Henry.
Hi.
Hello, Henry, and we are taking a look today at our first president of the United States. Who is it, Henry?
George Washington.
That's right, George Washington. A lot of you are probably thinking to yourselves, well, why the heck are you guys doing George Washington again? You guys already did it once.
Well,
yeah,
we messed up.
Yeah, we messed up. He's right. Henry's right. So really what it came down to was two or three things. One, first and foremost and most important, I did receive some very poor misinformation from actually a guide at Mount Vernon who, when I visited there last year, decided to inform me that George Washington was against slavery and really wasn't about slavery and, wanted to free all his slaves and that sort of thing. And that is what I reported in my very first Washington video, which is completely not true, completely very misguided and wrong information. And I wanted to set the record straight. So that was first and foremost. Now that I have this YouTube channel, we have a really good following of fans, right, and subscribers.
Yep.
And we just, we want to try to be as accurate as we can. We try to leave politics out of this. I know that sounds silly because it's about presidents and such, but this isn't about our political beliefs. This is about just trying to factually tell you guys about what went on historically and then give our opinions on, like, the grave sites and such of these people. So, so that's really what this is about. So I want it to be as historically accurate as possible. That's why we're doing this over again. That was the first biggest reason. Second reason was the George Washington video was like our second or third video.
Yeah, and it had a different thumbnail than all the other different president thumbnails.
Yeah, that's right. Henry's correct. So, the first video we ever did was an introduction video. That really wasn't much. Then the second video we actually really produced was our JFK assassination video.
Yep, and then the third video was the George Washington video.
That's right. And then
the mess-up video.
Yeah, the mess-up video, the George Washington video. So it wasn't very well done, I don't think, in my opinion. It was only about 20 minutes long, so we really crammed all this George Washington information into like 20 minutes when we have, 2 parts and over like 2 hours of information for like Herbert Hoover. It just doesn't, I don't mean to disparage Herbert Hoover, but it just doesn't seem accurate to do that. So what we decided to do was do this over, better video, all that stuff, and, like Henry said, an actual thumbnail that goes along with the rest of the thumbnails.
Yeah.
And, this 2-part video. So that's why we're doing this George Washington video over again. We hope you really enjoy it. Part 1 here is going to be about his birthplace and his early life, and then his military rise. He is obviously a very, very big Revolutionary War hero. Probably our biggest war hero of all time. So we wanted to make sure that we definitely paid homage to George Washington, because this is not about disparaging George Washington or trying to vilify him. George Washington did some truly amazing, incredible things.
Yes, and
for our country.
And then not some good things.
Yes, exactly, like Henry just said. So George Washington did some amazing, wonderful, great things, and then unfortunately there was some ugly and not so good things about slavery and such, and we're going to touch on that and obviously cover that in this revised video. So we hope you enjoy part 1. We're going to jump right into it. Henry will probably check back in with us and make little cameo appearances, but for the most part, you got me on this audio, so we're going to jump right in, right, Henry?
Yep.
Taking a look at who?
George Washington.
That's right, our first president of the United States. So here we go. So another thing real quick that I wanted to touch on with everybody is my sources. It would be impossible for me to list every single source of information that I get throughout all of my videos. I use a plethora of different sources. Obviously, if I'm reading directly from like a book, I try to always credit that book and that author, such as, for example, The President is Dead by Louis Picone, which is a wonderful book that I use all the time and read from. If there's a magazine article, like in Time Magazine, I try to always cite Time Magazine. Somebody did comment, I guess a couple weeks ago about, it's like you read from Wikipedia every week or something to that effect. And yes, I've never hid from the fact that I absolutely do. I pretty much read verbatim from Wikipedia regarding the early life of the figure, whoever it is that we're speaking about. I know Wikipedia is not 100% always accurate, but when it comes to things like the early life and childhood and that sort of thing of a president, it's pretty fairly accurate. I mean, you get the same information anywhere you look. So yeah, I do read from it. I think people would rather me just kind of read from that, and then you can see pictures that go along with it, rather than go read it themselves. They learn stuff from it, of course, and from my reading. But that is not the only source I use. Wikipedia is not the only source I use at all. I use several different websites that I usually find facts about the person. Sometimes, like historychannel.com or history.com, whatever it's called. And there will be in this actual, George Washington videos, there will be several books that I will be citing and giving credit to the author about. So, just keep that in mind. I don't want people to think that I'm trying to be deceitful or misconstruing things. I do read from Wikipedia and several other places to get my facts here. So, that's the way this works. So let's start off. Here we go. The early life of George Washington. The Washington family was a wealthy Virginia planter family that had made its fortune through land speculation and the cultivation of tobacco. Washington's great-grandfather, John Washington, immigrated in 1656 from Sulgrave, Northamptonshire, England, to the English colony of Virginia, where he accumulated 5,000 acres of land, including Little Hunting Creek on the Potomac River. George Washington was born on February 22nd of 1732 at Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia, and was the first of 6 children of Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. His father was a justice of the peace and a prominent public figure who had 4 additional children from his first marriage to Jane Butler. The family moved to Little Hunting Creek in 1735. 3 years later, in 1738, they moved to Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg, Virginia, on the Rappahannock River. When Augustine died in 1743, George Washington inherited Ferry Farm and 10 slaves. His older half-brother Lawrence inherited Little Hunting Creek and renamed it Mount Vernon. Washington did not have the formal education his elder brothers received at Appleby Grammar School in England, but he did learn mathematics, trigonometry, and land surveying. He was a talented draftsman and map maker. By early adulthood, he was writing with considerable force and precision. However, his writing displayed little wit or humor. In pursuit of admiration, status, and power, he tended to attribute his shortcomings and failures to someone else's ineffectuality. Washington often visited Mount Vernon and Belvoir, the plantation that belonged to Lawrence's father-in-law, William Fairfax. Fairfax became Washington's patron and surrogate father, and Washington spent a month in 1748 with a team surveying Fairfax's Shenandoah Valley property. He received a surveyor's license the following year from the College of William and Mary. Even though George Washington had not served the customary apprenticeship, Fairfax appointed him surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia, and he appeared in Culpeper County to take his oath of office on July 20th of 1749. He subsequently familiarized himself with the frontier region, and though he resigned from the job in 1750, he continued to do surveys west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. By 1752, he had bought almost 1,500 acres in the valley and owned 2,315 acres. In 1751, George Washington made his only trip abroad when he accompanied Lawrence to Barbados, hoping the climate would cure his brother's tuberculosis. Washington contracted smallpox during that trip, which immunized him but left his face slightly scarred. Lawrence did die in 1752, and George Washington leased Mount Vernon from his widow. He inherited it outright after her death in 1761. Lawrence Washington's service as an adjutant general of the Virginia militia inspired his half-brother George to seek a commission. Virginia's lieutenant governor, Robert Dinwiddie, appointed George Washington as a major and commander of one of the 4 militia districts. The British and French were competing for control of the Ohio Valley. While the British were constructing forts along the Ohio River, the French were doing the same, constructing forts between the Ohio River and Lake Erie. In October of 1753, Dinwiddie appointed George Washington as a special envoy. He had sent George to demand French forces to vacate land that was being claimed by the British. Washington was also appointed to make peace with the Iroquois Confederacy and to gather further intelligence about the French forces. Washington met with half-king Tanacharison and other Iroquois chiefs at Logstown and gathered information about the numbers and locations of the French forts, as well as intelligence concerning individuals taken prisoner by the French. And I believe that's actually half-king Tanarison is really the correct pronunciation of it. So George Washington was given the nickname Kanatakaharis, town destroyer or devourer of villages, by Tanacharison. The nickname had previously been given to his great-grandfather John Washington in the late 17th century by the Susquehannock. Washington's party reached the Ohio River in November of 1753 and were intercepted by a French patrol. The party was escorted to Fort Le Boeuf, where Washington was received in a friendly manner. He delivered the British demand to vacate to the French commander, St. Pierre, but the French refused to leave. St. Pierre gave Washington his official answer in a sealed envelope after a few days' delay, as well as food and extra winter clothing for his party's journey back to Virginia. Washington completed the precarious mission in 77 days in difficult winter conditions, achieving a measure of distinction when his report was published in Virginia and in London. Now a bit about the French and Indian War. In February of 1754, Dinwiddie promoted Washington to lieutenant colonel and second in command of the 300-strong Virginia Regiment with orders to confront French forces at the Forks of the Ohio. Washington set out for the Forks with half the regiment in April, but he soon learned a French force of 1,000 had begun construction in Fort Duquesne there, or maybe Fort Duquesne. In May, having set up a defensive position at Great Meadows, he learned that the French had made camp 7 miles away. He decided to take the offensive. The French detachment proved to be only about 50 men, so Washington advanced on May 28th with a small force of Virginians and Indian allies to ambush them. What took place, known as the Battle of Jumonville Glen, or the Jumonville Affair, was disputed, but French forces were killed outright with muskets and hatchets. French commander Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, who carried a diplomatic message for the British to evacuate, was killed. French forces found Jumonville and some of his men dead and scalped and assumed Washington was responsible. Washington blamed his translator for not communicating the French intentions. Dinwiddie congratulated Washington for his victory over the French. This incident ignited the French and Indian War, which later became part of the larger 7 Years' War. The full Virginia regiment joined Washington at Fort Necessity the following month with news that he had been reinforced by an independent... Following month that he had been promoted to... I read that wrong. The full Virginia regiment joined Washington at Fort Necessity the following month with news that he had been promoted to command of the regiment and the colonel upon the regimental commander's death. the regiment was reinforced by an independent company of 100 South Carolinians led by Captain James Mackay, whose royal commission outranked that of Washington, and a conflict of command ensued. On July 3rd, a French force attacked with 900 men, and the ensuing battle ended in Washington's surrender. In the aftermath, Colonel James Innes took command of intercolonial forces. The Virginia regiment was divided, and Washington was offered of a captaincy, which he refused, with the resignation of his commission. In 1755, Washington served voluntarily as an aide to General Edward Braddock, who led a British expedition to expel the French from Fort Duquesne and the Ohio country. On Washington's recommendation, Braddock split the army into one main column and a lightly equipped flying column. Suffering from a severe case of dysentery, George Washington was left behind, and when he rejoined Braddock at Monongahela, the French and their Indian allies ambushed the divided army. 2/3 of the British force became casualties, including the mortally wounded Braddock. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage, Washington, who was still very ill, rallied the survivors and formed a rear guard, allowing the remnants of the force to disengage and retreat. During the engagement, he had 2 horses shot from under him, and his hat and coat were bullet-pierced. His conduct under fire redeemed his reputation among critics of his command in the Battle of Fort Necessity, but he was not included by the succeeding commander, Colonel Thomas Dunbar, in planning subsequent operations. The Virginia Regiment was reconstituted in August of 1755, and Dinwiddie appointed Washington its commander, again captain of superior royal rank, who commanded a detachment. See, I keep reading the wrong thing. I apologize to you guys so much. The real sentence is the Virginia Regiment was reconstituted in August of 1755, and Dinwiddie appointed Washington its commander. Again, with the rank of colonel, Washington clashed over seniority almost immediately, this time with John Dagworthy, another captain of superior royal rank, who commanded a detachment of Marylanders at the regiment's headquarters in Fort Cumberland. Washington, impatient for an offensive against Fort Duquesne, was convinced Braddock would have granted him a royal commission and pressed his case in February of 1756 with Braddock's successor, William Shirley, and again in January of 1757 with Shirley's successor, Lord Loudon. Shirley ruled in Washington's favor only in the matter of Dagworthy. Loudon humiliated Washington, refused him as a royal commission, and agreed only to relieve him of the responsibility of manning Fort Cumberland. In 1758, the Virginia Regiment was assigned to the British Forbes expedition to capture Fort Duquesne, however it's pronounced. Washington disagreed with General John Forbes' tactics and chosen route. Forbes nevertheless made Washington a brevet brigadier general and gave him command of one of the 3 brigades that would assault the fort. The French abandoned the fort and the valley before the assault was launched. Washington saw only a friendly fire incident which left 14 dead and 26 injured. The war lasted another 4 years, but Washington resigned his commission and returned to Mount Vernon. Under Washington, the Virginia Regiment had defended 300 miles of frontier against 20 Indian attacks in 10 months. He increased the professionalism of the regiment as it increased from 300 to 1,000 men, and Virginia's frontier population suffered less than other colonies. Some historians have said that this was Washington's only unqualified success during the war. Though he failed to realize a royal commission, he did gain self-confidence, leadership skills, and invaluable knowledge of British military tactics. The destructive competition Washington witnessed among colonial politicians fostered in his later support of a strong central government. So there you go, French and Indian War, and Washington's role in the French and Indian War. Pretty cool stuff. Now we're going to move on to his marriage and some other fun stuff. Most of it's going to be about his military, career, because that's quite extensive, leading up to him getting into politics and such. So here we go now. On January 6th of 1759, George Washington, at age 26, married Martha Dandridge Custis, the 27-year-old widow of wealthy plantation owner Daniel Parke Custis. The marriage took place at Martha's estate. She was intelligent, gracious, and experienced in managing a planter's estate, and the couple created a happy marriage. They raised John Parke Custis, Jackie, and Martha Parke Custis, Patsy, children from her previous marriage, and later Jackie's children, Eleanor Parke Custis, Nellie, and George Washington Parke Custis, Washi. I feel like I'm reading hockey nicknames. That's like every NHL hockey player nickname is like, Billy, it's like Gibby, Soupy. It's all these ridiculous, like, end in Y type nicknames. Pretty funny. Washington's 1751 bout with smallpox is thought to have rendered him sterile, though it is equally likely that Martha may have sustained injury during the birth of Patsy, her final child, making additional births impossible. The couple lamented not having any children together. The couple lamented not having any children together. They moved to Mount Vernon, near Alexandria, where he took up life as a planter of tobacco and wheat and emerged as a political figure. The marriage gave Washington control over Martha's one-third dower interest in the 18,000-acre Custis estate, and he managed the remaining two-thirds for Martha's children. The estate also included 84 slaves. He became one of Virginia's wealthiest men, which increased his social standing. At Washington's urging, Governor Lord Bodetart fulfilled Dinwiddie's 1754 promise of land bounties to all volunteer militia during the French and Indian War. In late 1770, Washington inspected the lands in the Ohio and Great Kanawha regions, and he engaged surveyor William Crawford to subdivide it. Crawford allotted 23,200 acres to Washington. Washington told the veterans that their land was hilly and unsuitable for farming, and he agreed to purchase 20,147 acres, leaving some feeling they had been duped. He also doubled the size of Mount Vernon to 6,500 acres and increased its slave population to more than 100 by 1775. Washington's political activities included supporting the candidacy of his friend George William Fairfax in his 1755 bid to represent the region in the Virginia House of Burgesses. This support led to a dispute which resulted in a physical altercation between Washington and another Virginia planter, William Payne. Washington diffused the situation, including ordering officers from the Virginia regiment to stand down. Washington apologized to Payne the following day at a tavern. Payne had been expecting to be challenged to a duel. As a respected military hero and large landowner, George Washington held local offices and was elected to the Virginia Provincial Legislature representing Frederick County in the House of Burgesses for 7 years, beginning in 1758. He plied the voters with beer, brandy, and other beverages, although he was absent while serving on the Forbes expedition. He won the election with roughly 40% of the vote, defeating 3 other candidates with the help of several local supporters. He rarely spoke in his early legislative career, but he became a prominent critic of Britain's taxation policy and mercantilist policies towards the American colonies starting in the 1760s. By occupation, Washington was a planter, and he imported luxuries and other goods from England, paying for them by exporting tobacco. His spending combined with low tobacco prices left him in debt by 1764, prompting him to diversify his holdings. In 1765, because of erosion and other soil problems, he changed Mount Vernon's primary cash crop from tobacco to wheat and expanded operations to include corn flour milling and fishing. Washington also took time for leisure with fox hunting, fishing, dances, theater, cards, backgammon, and billiards. Washington was soon counted among the political and social elite in Virginia. From 1768 to 1775, he invited some 2,000 guests to his Mount Vernon estate, mostly those whom he considered people of rank. He became more politically active in 1769, presenting legislation in the Virginia Assembly to establish an embargo on goods from Great Britain. Washington's stepdaughter, Patsy Custis, suffered from epileptic attacks from age 12, and she died in his arms in 1773. The following day, he wrote to Burwell Bassett, "It is easier to conceive than to describe the distress of this family." He canceled all business activity and remained with Martha every night for 3 months. I apologize for the mispronunciation of some of these towns or generals' names and that sort of thing. So I apologize, of course. So now a little bit about Washington and British Parliament and that sort of thing. George Washington played a central role before and during the American Revolution. His disdain for the British military had become when he was passed over for promotion into the regular army. Opposed to taxes imposed by the British Parliament on the colonies without proper representation, he and other colonists were also angered by the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which banned American settlement west of the Allegheny Mountains and protected the British fur trade. Washington believed the Stamp Act of 1765 was an act of oppression, and he celebrated its repeal the following year. In March of 1766, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting that parliamentary law superseded colonial law. In the late 1760s, the interference of the British Crown in American lucrative Western land speculation spurred on the American Revolution. Washington himself was a prosperous land speculator, and in 1767, he encouraged adventurers to acquire backcountry Western lands. Washington helped lead widespread protest against the Townshend Acts passed by Parliament in 1767, and he introduced a proposal in May of 1769, drafted by George Mason, which called Virginians to boycott British goods. The acts were mostly repealed in 1770. Parliament sought to punish Massachusetts colonists for their role in the Boston Tea Party in 1774 by passing the Coercive Acts, which Washington referred to as an invasion of our rights and privileges. He said Americans must not submit to acts of tyranny, since custom and use shall make us as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. That July, he and George Mason drafted a list of resolutions for the Fairfax County Committee, which Washington chaired, and the committee adopted the Fairfax Resolves, calling for a Continental Congress. On August 1st, George Washington attended the First Virginia Convention, where he was selected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress, September 5th to October 26th of 1774, which he also attended. As tensions rose in 1774, he helped train county militias in Virginia and organized enforcement of the Continental Association boycott of British goods instituted by the Congress. The American Revolutionary War began on April 19th of 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord and the Siege of Boston. The colonists were divided over breaking away from British rule and split into two factions. patriots who rejected British rule, and loyalists who desired to remain subject to the king. General Thomas Gage was commander of British forces in America at the beginning of the war. Upon hearing the shocking news of the onset of war, George Washington was sobered and dismayed, and he hastily departed Mount Vernon on May 4th of 1775 to join the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. So what do you think, Henry? George Washington was a pretty big military guy, huh?
Yep.
French and Indian War, and now we're starting to touch on the Revolutionary War. And he was big. He was big into, being against the king and the British rule, and he was big about the no taxation without representation, right?
Yep.
Pretty cool, right?
Yep.
This is all the stuff you don't really learn in school, right?
Yeah.
You learn about the silly stuff like the cherry tree being being chopped down. Yeah, exactly. Quote unquote the cherry tree. Well, thanks for chiming in, Henry.
You're welcome.
All right, so now Congress created the Continental Army on June 14th of 1775, and Samuel and John Adams nominated George Washington to become its commander-in-chief. Washington was chosen over John Hancock because of his military experience and the belief that a Virginian would better unite the colonies. He was considered an incisive leader who kept his ambition in check. He was unanimously elected commander-in-chief by Congress the next day. Washington appeared before Congress in uniform and gave an acceptance speech on June 16th, declining a salary, though he was later reimbursed expenses. He was commissioned on June 19th and was roundly praised by congressional delegates, including John Adams, who proclaimed that he was the man best suited to lead and unite the colonies. Congress appointed Washington General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies and all the forces raised or to be raised by them, and instructed him to take charge of the Siege of Boston on June 22nd of 1775. Congress chose his primary staff officers, including Major General Artemus Ward, Adjutant General Horatio Gates, Major General Charles Lee, Major General Philip Schuyler, Major General Nathaniel Greene, Colonel Henry Knox, and Colonel Alexander Hamilton. Washington was impressed by Colonel Benedict Arnold and gave him responsibility for launching an invasion of Canada. He also engaged French and Indian War compatriot Brigadier General Daniel Morgan. Henry Knox impressed Adams with ordnance knowledge, and Washington promoted him to colonel and chief of artillery. At the start of the war, George Washington opposed the recruiting of blacks, both free and enslaved, into the Continental Army. After his appointment, George Washington banned their enlistment. The British saw an opportunity to divide the colonies, and the colonial governor of Virginia issued a proclamation which promised freedom of slaves of patriot masters if they joined the British. Desperate for manpower by late 1777, Washington relented and overturned his ban. By the end of the war, around 1/10 of Washington's army were blacks. And we're going to get into all the stuff about Washington's relationship with slavery in part 2, which there's a lot for me to touch on. So keep that in mind here. Early in 1775, in response to the growing rebellious movement, London sent British troops commanded by General Thomas Gage to occupy Boston. They set up fortifications about the city, making it impervious to attack. Various local militias surrounded the city and effectively trapped the British, resulting in a standoff. As Washington headed for Boston, word of his march preceded him, and he was greeted everywhere. Gradually, he became a symbol of the Patriot cause. Upon arrival on July 2nd of 1775, 2 weeks after the Patriot defeat at nearby Bunker Hill, he set up his Cambridge, Massachusetts headquarters and inspected the new army there, only to find an undisciplined and badly outfitted militia. After consultation, he initiated Benjamin Franklin's suggested reforms, drilling the soldiers and imposing strict discipline, floggings, and incarceration. Washington ordered his officers to identify the skills of recruits to ensure military effectiveness while removing incompetent officers. He petitioned Gage, his former superior, to release captured Patriot officers from prison and treat them humanely. In October of 1775, King George III declared that the colonies were in open rebellion and relieved General Gage of command for incompetence, replacing him with General William Howe. In June 1775, Congress ordered an invasion of Canada. It was led by Benedict Arnold, who, despite Washington's strong objection, drew volunteers from the latter's force during the Siege of Boston. The move on Quebec failed, with the American forces being reduced to less than half and forced to retreat. The Continental Army further diminished by expiring short-term enlistments, and by January of 1776, reduced by half to 9,600 men, had to be supplemented with the militia, and was joined by Knox with heavy artillery captured from Fort Ticonderoga. When the Charles River froze over, Washington was eager to cross and storm Boston. But General Gates and others were opposed to untrained militia striking well-garrisoned fortifications. Washington reluctantly agreed to secure the Dorchester Heights, 100 feet above Boston, in an attempt to force the British out of the city. On March 9th, under the cover of darkness, Washington's troops brought up Knox's big guns and bombarded British ships in Boston Harbor. On March 17th, 9,000 British troops and loyalists began a chaotic 10-day evacuation of Boston aboard 120 ships. Soon after, Washington entered the city with 500 men, with explicit orders not to plunder the city. He ordered vaccinations against smallpox to great effect, as he did later in Morristown, New Jersey. He refrained from exerting military authority in Boston, leaving civilian matters in the hands of local authorities. So pretty cool stuff. Just marching along here in the Revolutionary War with George Washington. Washington then proceeded to New York City, arriving on April 13th of 1776, and he began constructing fortifications to thwart the expected British attack. He ordered his occupying forces to treat civilians and their property with respect, to avoid the abuses which Bostonian citizens suffered at the hands of British troops during their occupation. A plot to assassinate or capture him was discovered but thwarted, resulting in the arrest of 98 people involved or complicit, 56 of which were from Long Island, including the Loyalist mayor of New York, David Matthews. Washington's bodyguard, Thomas Hickey, was hanged for mutiny and sedition. General Howe transported his resupplied army with the British fleet from Halifax to New York, knowing the city was key to securing the continent. George Germain, who ran the British war effort in England, believed it could be won with one decisive blow. The British forces, including more than 100 ships and thousands of troops, began arriving on Staten Island in July 2nd to lay siege to the city. After the Declaration of Independence was adopted on July 4th, Washington informed his troops in his general orders of July 9th that Congress had declared the United Colonies to be free and independent states. Howe's troop strength totaled 32,000 regulars and Hessians auxiliaries. And Washington's consisted of 23,000, mostly raw recruits and militia. In August, Howe landed 20,000 troops at Gravesend, Brooklyn, and approached Washington's fortifications, as George III proclaimed the rebellious American colonists to be traitors. Washington, opposing his generals, chose to fight, based upon inaccurate information that Howe's army had only 8,000 plus troops. In the Battle of Long Island, Howe assaulted Washington's flank and inflicted 1,500 Patriot casualties, the British suffering only 400. Washington retreated, instructing General William Heath to acquisition river craft in the area. On August 30th, General William Alexander held off the British and gave cover while the army crossed the East River under darkness to Manhattan Island without loss of life or material, although Alexander was captured. Howe, emboldened by his Long Island victory, dispatched Washington as George Washington Esquire in futility to negotiate peace. Washington declined, demanding to be addressed with diplomatic protocol as general and fellow belligerent, not as a rebel, lest his men are hanged as such if captured. The Royal Navy bombarded the unstable earthworks on Lower Manhattan Island. Washington, with misgivings, heeded the advice of Generals Greene and Putnam to defend Fort Washington. They were unable to hold it, and Washington abandoned it despite General Lee's objections. As his army retired north to the White Plains, Howe's pursuit forced Washington to retreat across the Hudson River to Fort Lee to avoid encirclement. Howe landed his troops on Manhattan in November and captured Fort Washington, inflicting high casualties on the Americans. Washington was responsible for delaying the retreat, though he blamed Congress and General Greene. Loyalists in New York considered Howe a liberator and spread a rumor that Washington had set fire to the city. Patriot morale reached its lowest when Lee was captured. Now reduced to 5,400 troops, Washington's army retreated through New Jersey, and Howe broke off in pursuit, delaying his advance on Philadelphia, and he set up winter quarters in New York. Now to talk about the famous crossing. Washington crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, where Lee's replacement John Sullivan joined him with 2,000 more troops. The future of the Continental Army was in doubt for lack of supplies, a harsh winter, expiring enlistments, and desertions. Washington was disappointed that many New Jersey residents were loyalists or skeptical about the prospect of independence. Howe split up his British army and posted a Hessian garrison at Trenton to hold western New Jersey and the east shore of the Delaware. But the army appeared complacent, and Washington and his generals devised a surprise attack on the Hessians at Trenton, which he codenamed Victory or Death. The army was to cross the Delaware River to Trenton in 3 divisions, one led by Washington with 2,400 troops, another by General James Ewing with 700, and the third by Colonel John Cadwalader with 1,500. The force was to then split, with Washington taking the Pennington Road and General Sullivan traveling south on the river's edge. Washington first ordered a 60-mile search for Durham boats to transport his army, and he ordered the destruction of vessels that could be used by the British. Washington crossed the Delaware River on Christmas night, December 25th of 1776, while he personally risked capture, staking out the Jersey shoreline. His men followed across the ice-obstructed river in sleet and snow from McConkey's Ferry, with 40 men per vessel. The wind churned up the waters, and they were pelted with hail. But by 3 a.m. on December 26th, they made it across with no losses. Henry Knox was delayed, managing frightened horses and about 18 field guns on flat-bottomed ferries. Cadwalader and Ewing failed to cross due to the icy and heavy currents, and awaiting Washington doubted his planned attack on Trenton. Once Knox arrived, Washington proceeded to Trenton to take only his troops against the Hessians, rather than risk being spotted returning his army to Pennsylvania. The troops spotted Hessian positions a mile from Trenton, so Washington split his force into 2 columns, rallying his men. "Soldiers, keep by your officers. For God's sake, keep by your officers." The 2 columns were separated at the Birmingham crossroads. General Nathanael Greene's column took the Upper Ferry Road, led by Washington, and General John Sullivan's column advanced on River Road. The Americans marched in sleet and snowfall. Many were shoeless with bloodied feet, and 2 died of exposure. At sunrise, Washington led them in a surprise attack on the Hessians, aided by Major General Knox and artillery. The Hessians had 22 killed, including Colonel Johann Rall, 83 wounded, and 850 captured with supplies. Washington retreated across Delaware River to Pennsylvania, but he returned to New Jersey on January 3rd, launching an attack on British regulars at Princeton. With 40 Americans killed or wounded and 273 British killed or captured, Americans Generals Hugh Mercer and John Cadwalader were being driven back by the British when Mercer was mortally wounded. Then Washington arrived and led the men in a counterattack, which advanced to within 30 yards of the British line. Some British troops retreated after a brief stand, while others took refuge in Nassau Hall, which became the target of Colonel Alexander Hamilton's cannons. Washington's troops charged. The British surrendered in less than an hour, and 194 soldiers laid down their arms. Howe retreated to New York City, where his army remained inactive until early the next year. Washington's depleted Continental Army took up winter headquarters in Morristown, New Jersey, while disrupting British supply lines and expelling them from parts of New Jersey. Washington later said that the British could have successfully counterattacked his encampment before his troops were dug in. The victories at Trenton and Princeton by Washington revived Patriot morale and changed the course of the war. The British still controlled New York, and many Patriot soldiers did not re-enlist or deserted after the harsh winter campaign. Congress instituted greater rewards for re-enlisting and punishments for desertion to effect greater troop numbers. Strategically, Washington's victories were pivotal for the Revolution and quashed the British strategy of showing overwhelming force followed by offering generous terms. In February of 1777, word reached London of the American victories at Trenton and Princeton, and the British realized the Patriots were in a position to demand unconditional independence. In July of 1777, British General John Burgoyne led the Saratoga campaign from Quebec through Lake Champlain, and recaptured Fort Ticonderoga, intending to divide New England, including control of the Hudson River. However, General Howe in British-occupied New York blundered, taking his army south to Philadelphia rather than up the Hudson River to join Burgoyne near Albany. Meanwhile, Washington and Gilbert de Motier, Marquis de Lafayette, rushed to Philadelphia to engage Howe and were shocked to learn of Burgoyne's progress in upstate New York, where the Patriots were led by General Philip Schuyler and successor Horatio Gates. Washington's army of less experienced men were defeated in the pitched battles at Philadelphia. Howe outmaneuvered Washington at the Battle of Brandywine on September 11th of 1777, and he marched unopposed into the nation's capital at Philadelphia. A Patriot attack failed against the British at Germantown in October. Major General Thomas Conway prompted some members of Congress to consider removing Washington from command because of the losses incurred at Philadelphia. Washington's supporters resisted, and the matter was finally dropped after much deliberation. Once the plot was exposed, Conway wrote an apology to Washington, resigned, and returned to France. Washington was concerned with Howe's movements during the Saratoga campaign to the north, and he was also aware that Burgoyne was moving south towards Saratoga from Quebec. Washington took some risks to support Gates's army, sending reinforcements north with Generals Benedict Arnold, his most aggressive field commander, and Benjamin Lincoln. On October 7th of 1777, Burgoyne tried to take Bemis Heights, but was isolated from support by Howe. He was forced to retreat to Saratoga and ultimately surrendered after the battles of Saratoga. As Washington suspected, Gates's victory emboldened his critics. Biographer John Alden maintains it was inevitable that the defeats of Washington's forces and the concurrent victory of the forces in Upper New York should be compared. The admiration for Washington was waning, including little credit from John Adams. British Commander Howe resigned in May of 1778, left America forever, and was replaced by Sir Henry Clinton. Washington's army of 11,000 went into winter quarters at Valley Forge, north of Philadelphia, in December of 1777. They suffered between 2,000 and 3,000 deaths in the extreme cold over 6 months, mostly from disease and lack of food, clothing, and shelter. Meanwhile, the British were comfortably quartered in Philadelphia, paying for supplies in pounds sterling, while Washington struggled with a devalued American paper currency. The woodlands were soon exhausted of game, and by February, lowered morale and increased desertions ensued. Washington made repeated petitions to the Continental Congress for provisions. He received a congressional delegation to check the Army's conditions and express the urgency of the situation, proclaiming something must be done. Important alterations must be made. He recommended that Congress expedite supplies, and Congress agreed to strengthen and fund the Army's supply lines by reorganizing the Commissary Department. By late February, supplies began arriving. Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben's incessant drilling soon transformed Washington's recruit into a disciplined fighting force, and the revitalized army emerged from Valley Forge early the following year. Washington promoted von Steuben to Major General and made him Chief of Staff. In early 1778, the French responded to Burgoyne's defeat and entered into a treaty of alliance with the Americans. The Continental Congress ratified the treaty in May, which amounted to a French declaration of war against Britain. The British evacuated Philadelphia for New York that June, and Washington summoned a war council of American and French generals. He chose a partial attack on the retreating British at the Battle of Monmouth. The British were commanded by Howe's successor, General Henry Clinton. Generals Charles Lee and Lafayette moved 4,000 men without Washington's knowledge and bungled their first attack on June 28th. Washington relieved Lee and achieved a draw after an expansive battle. At nightfall, the British continued their retreat to New York, and Washington moved his army outside the city. Monmouth was Washington's last battle in the North. He valued the safety of his army more than towns with little value to the British. By the way, the Battle of Monmouth is my backyard. I grew up in Monmouth County, New Jersey. So, yes, Battle of Monmouth and the battlegrounds. Still a, historical park. Preserved. Very cool. Not far from me at all. The West Point espionage. Washington became America's first spy master by designing an espionage system against the British. In 1778, Major Benjamin Talmadge formed the Culper Ring at Washington's direction to covertly collect information about the British in New York. Washington had disregarded incidents of disloyalty by Benedict Arnold, who had distinguished himself in many battles. During mid-1780, Arnold began supplying British spymaster John Andre with sensitive information intended to compromise Washington and capture West Point, a key American defensive position on the Hudson River. Historians have noted as possible reasons for Arnold's treachery his anger at losing promotions to junior offices or repeated slights from Congress. He was also deeply in debt, profiteering from the war, and disappointed by Washington's lack of support during his eventual court-martial. Arnold repeatedly asked for command of West Point, and Washington finally agreed in August. Benedict Arnold met André on September 21st, giving him plans to take over the garrison. Militia forces captured André and discovered the plans, but Arnold escaped to New York. Washington recalled the commanders positioned under Arnold at key points around the fort to prevent any complicity, but he did not suspect Arnold's wife, Peggy. Washington assumed personal command at West Point and reorganized its defenses. André's trial for espionage ended in a death sentence, and Washington offered to return him to the British in exchange for Arnold. But Clinton refused. André was hanged on October 2nd of 1780, despite his last request being to face a firing squad to deter other spies. In late 1778, General Clinton shipped 3,000 troops from New York to Georgia and launched a southern invasion against Savannah. Reinforced by 2,000 British and Loyalist troops, they repelled an attack by Patriots and French naval forces, which bolstered the British war effort. In mid-1779, Washington attacked Iroquois warriors of the Six Nations to force Britain's Indian allies out of New York, from which they had assaulted New England towns. In response, Indian warriors joined with Loyalist Rangers led by Walter Butler and killed more than 200 frontiersmen in June, laying waste to the Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania. Washington retaliated by ordering General John Sullivan to lead an expedition to effect the total destruction and devastation of Iroquois villages and take their women and children hostage. Those who managed to escape fled to Canada. Washington's troops went into quarters at Morristown, New Jersey during the winter of 1779 to 1780 and suffered their worst winter of the war, with temperatures well below freezing. New York Harbor was frozen over, snow and ice covered the ground for weeks, and the troops again lacked provisions. Clinton assembled 12,500 troops and attacked Charlestown, South Carolina, in January 1780, defeating General Benjamin Lincoln, who had only 5,100 Continental troops. The British went on to occupy the South Carolina Piedmont in June, with no Patriot resistance. Clinton returned to New York and left 8,000 troops commanded by General Charles Cornwallis. Congress replaced Lincoln with Horatio Gates. He failed in South Carolina and was replaced by Washington's choice of Nathanael Greene, but the British already had the South in their grasp. Washington was reinvigorated, however, when Lafayette returned from France with more ships, men, and supplies, and 5,000 veteran French troops led by Marshal Rochambeau arrived at Newport, Rhode Island in July of 1780. French naval forces then landed, led by Admiral Grassi, and Washington encouraged Rochambeau to move his fleet south to launch a joint land and naval attack on Arnold's troops. Washington's armies went into winter quarters at New Windsor, New York in December of 1780, and Washington urged Congress and state officials to expedite provisions in hopes that the Army would not continue to struggle under the same difficulties they have endured. On March 1st of 1781, Congress ratified the Articles of Confederation, but the government that took effect on March 2nd did not have the power to levy taxes, and it loosely held the states together. General Clinton sent Benedict Arnold, now a British brigadier general with 1,700 troops, to Virginia to capture Portsmouth and conduct raids on Patriot forces from there. Washington responded by sending Lafayette south to counter Arnold's efforts. Washington initially hoped to bring the fight to New York, drawing off British forces from Virginia and ending the war there. But Rochambeau advised Grassi that Cornwallis in Virginia was the better target. Grassi's fleet arrived off the Virginia coast, and Washington saw the advantage. He made a feint towards Clinton in New York, then headed south to Virginia. The Siege of Yorktown was a decisive Allied victory by the combined forces of the Continental Army commanded by General Washington, the French Army commanded by the General Comte de Rochambeau, and the French Navy commanded by Admiral de Grasse. In the defeat of Cornwallis's British forces, on August 19th, the march to Yorktown, led by Washington and Rochambeau, began, which is known as the Celebrated March. Washington was in command of an army of 7,800 Frenchmen, 3,100 militia, and 8,000 Continentals. Not well experienced in siege warfare, Washington often referred to the judgment of General Rochambeau and used his advice about how to proceed. However, Rochambeau never challenged Washington's authority as the battle's commanding officer. And by late September, Patriot French forces surrounded Yorktown, trapped the British Army, and prevented British reinforcements from Clinton in the north, while the French Navy emerged victorious at the Battle of the Chesapeake. The final American offensive was begun with a shot fired by Washington. The siege ended with a British surrender on October 19th of 1781. Over 7,000 British soldiers were made prisoners of war in the last major land battle of the American Revolutionary War. Washington negotiated the terms of surrender for 2 days, and the official signing ceremony took place on October 19th. Cornwallis claimed illness and was absent, sending General Charles O'Hara as his proxy. As a gesture of goodwill, Washington held a dinner for the American, French, and British generals, all of whom fraternized on friendly terms and identified with one another as members of the same professional military caste. After the surrender at Yorktown, a situation developed that threatened relations between the newly independent America and Britain. Following a series of retributive executions between patriots and loyalists, Washington, on May 18th of 1782, wrote in a letter to General Moses Hazen that a British captain would be executed in retaliation for the execution of Joshua Huddy, a popular patriot leader who was hanged at the direction of the loyalist Richard Lippincott. Washington wanted Lippincott himself to be executed, but was rebuffed. Subsequently, Charles Asgill was chosen instead by a drawing of lots from a hat. This was a violation of the 14th article of the Yorktown Articles of Capitulation, which protected prisoners of war from acts of retaliation. Later, Washington's feelings on matters changed. In a letter of November 13th of 1782 to Asgill, he acknowledged Asgill's letter and situation, expressing his desire not to see any harm come to him. And after much consideration between the Continental Congress, Alexander Hamilton, Washington, and appeals from the French crown, Asgill was finally released, where Washington issued Asgill a pass that allowed his passage to New York. As peace negotiations started, the British gradually evacuated troops from Savannah, Charlestown, and New York by 1783, and the French army and navy likewise departed. The American treasury was empty, unpaid, and mutinous soldiers forced the adjournment of Congress, and Washington dispelled unrest by suppressing the Newburgh Conspiracy in March of 1783. Congress promised officers a 5-year bonus. Washington submitted an account of $450,000 in expenses which he had advanced to the Army. The account was settled, though it was allegedly vague about large sums and included expenses his wife had incurred through visits to his headquarters. Washington resigned as commander-in-chief once the Treaty of Paris was signed, and he planned to retire to Mount Vernon. The treaty was ratified by April of 1783, and Hamilton's Congressional Committee adapted the Army for peacetime. Washington gave the Army's perspective to the committee in his sentiments on a peace establishment. The treaty was signed on September 3rd of 1783, and Great Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. Washington then disbanded his army, giving an eloquent farewell address to his soldiers on November 2nd. On November 25th, the British evacuated New York City, and Washington and Governor George Clinton took possession. Washington advised Congress in August of 1783 to keep a standing army, create a national militia of separate state units, and establish a navy and a national military academy. He circulated his farewell orders that discharged his troops, whom he called one patriotic band of brothers. Before his return to Mount Vernon, he oversaw the evacuation of British forces in New York and was greeted by parades and celebrations, where he announced that Colonel Henry Knox had been promoted Commander-in-Chief. After leading the Continental Army for 8.5 years, George Washington bade farewell to his officers at Fraunces Tavern in December of 1783, and he resigned his commission days later, refuting Loyalist predictions that he would not relinquish his military command. In a final appearance in uniform, he gave a statement to the Congress. "I consider it an indispensable duty to close this last solemn act of my official life by commending the interests of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God, and those who have the superintendence of them, to his holy keeping." Washington's resignation was acclaimed at home and abroad and showed a skeptical world that the new republic would not degenerate into chaos. The same month, George Washington was appointed President General of the Society of the Cincinnati, a hereditary fraternity, and he served for the remainder of his life. Pretty good stuff there. So now, briefly going to just tell you about, really kind of his return to Mount Vernon, and then it gets into the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Washington was longing to return home after spending just 10 days at Mount Vernon out of 8.5 years of war. He arrived on Christmas Eve, delighted to be free of the bustle of a camp and the busy scenes of public life. He was a celebrity and was feted during a visit to his mother at Fredericksburg in February of 1784, and he received a constant stream of visitors wishing to pay their respects to him at Mount Vernon. Washington reactivated his interest in the Great Dismal Swamp and Potomac Canal projects begun before the war, though neither paid him any dividends, and he undertook a 34-day, 680-mile trip to check on his land holdings in the Ohio country. He oversaw the completion of the remodeling work at Mount Vernon, which transformed his residence into the mansion that survives to this day. Although his financial situation was not strong, creditors paid him in depreciated wartime currency, and he owed significant amounts in taxes and wages. Mount Vernon had made no profit during his absence, and he saw persistently poor crop yields due to pestilence and poor weather. His estate recorded its 11th year running at a deficit in 1787, and there was little prospect of improvement. Washington undertook a new landscaping plan and succeeded in cultivating a range of fast-growing trees and shrubs that were native to North America. He also began breeding mules after having been gifted a Spanish jack by King Charles III of Spain in 1784. There were few mules in the United States at that time, and he believed that properly bred mules would revolutionize agriculture and transportation. So that leads us all the way up to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Before returning to private life in June of 1783, Washington called for a strong union. Though he was concerned that he might be criticized for meddling in civil matters, he sent a circular letter to all the states maintaining that the Articles of Confederation was no more than a rope of sand linking the states. He believed the nation was on the verge of anarchy and confusion and was vulnerable to foreign intervention, and that a national constitution would unify the states under a strong central government. When Shays' Rebellion erupted in Massachusetts on August 29th of 1786 over taxation, Washington was further convinced that a national constitution was needed. Some nationalists feared that the new republic had descended into lawlessness, and they met together on September 11th of 1786 at Annapolis to ask Congress to revise the Articles of Confederation. One of their biggest efforts, however, was getting Washington to attend. Congress agreed to a constitutional convention to be held in Philadelphia in the spring of 1787, and each state was to send delegates. On December 4th of 1786, Washington was chosen to lead the Virginia delegation, but he declined on December 21st. He had concerns about the legality of the convention and consulted James Madison, Henry Knox, and others. They persuaded him to attend it. However, as his presence might induce reluctant states to send delegates and smooth the way for the ratification process. On March 28th, Washington told Governor Edmund Randolph that he would attend the convention, but made it clear that he was urged to attend. Washington arrived in Philadelphia on May 9th of 1787. It was not attained, though, until Friday, May 25th. Benjamin Franklin nominated Washington to preside over the convention, and he was unanimously elected to serve as President General. The convention's state-mandated purpose was to revise the Articles of Confederation, with all such alterations and further provisions required to improve them, and the new government would be established when the resulting document was duly confirmed by the several states. Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia introduced Madison's Virginia Plan on May 27th, the third day of the convention. It called for an entirely new constitution and a sovereign national government, which Washington highly recommended. Washington wrote to Alexander Hamilton on July 10th, "I almost despair of seeing a favorable issue to the proceedings of our convention, and do therefore repent having had any agency in the business." Nevertheless, he lent his prestige to the goodwill and the work of the other delegates. He unsuccessfully lobbied many to support ratification of the Constitution, such as an anti-federalist Patrick Henry. Washington told him, "The adoption of it under the present circumstances of the Union is, in my opinion, desirable," and declared the alternative would be anarchy. Washington and Madison then spent 4 days at Mount Vernon evaluating the new government's transition. And that's going to lead us all the way up to the presidency. Another thing, he was a chancellor of William and Mary. In 1788, the Board of Visitors of the College of William and Mary decided to reestablish the position of chancellor and elected George Washington to the office on January 18th. He continued to serve in the post through his presidency until his death in 1799. So he was chancellor of the College of William and Mary. It's another little thing to touch on. Then, just again, read a brief, little overview, and then I'll see if there's any fun facts, early on life fun facts to tell you before we wrap up this part one. So just another kind of overview. Washington was born on February 22nd of 1732 at his family's plantation on Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County in the British colony of Virginia. He was born to Augustine Washington and his second wife, Mary Ball Washington. We know all that. Few details about Washington's early education are known, although children of prosperous families like his typically were taught at home by private tutors or attended private schools. It is believed that he finished his former schooling at around age 15. And as a teenager, Washington who had shown an aptitude for mathematics, became a successful surveyor. His surveying expeditions into the Virginia wilderness earned him enough money to begin acquiring land of his own. In 1751, he made his only trip outside of America when he traveled to Barbados with his older half-brother Lawrence Washington, who was suffering from tuberculosis, and hoped the warm climate would help him recuperate. Shortly after their arrival, George contracted smallpox. We know all this. In December of 1752, Washington, who had no previous military experience, was made a commander of the Virginia militia. He saw action in the French and Indian War and was eventually put in charge of all Virginia's militia forces. And by 1759, Washington had resigned his commission, returned to Mount Vernon, and was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, where he served until 1774. January 1759, he married Martha Dandridge Custis. We know that. By the late 1760s, Washington had experienced firsthand the effects of rising taxes imposed on American colonists by the British, and he came to believe that it was in the best interest of the colonists to declare independence from England. Washington served as a delegate to the First Continental Congress in 1774 in Philadelphia, and by the time the Second Continental Congress convened a year later, the American Revolution had begun in earnest, and Washington was named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington proved to be a better general than military strategist. His strength lay not in his genius on the battlefield, but in his ability to keep the struggling colonial army together. His troops were poorly trained and lacked food, ammunition, and other supplies. Soldiers sometimes even went without shoes in winter. However, Washington was able to give them the direction and motivation. His leadership during the winter of 1777 and 1778 at Valley Forge was a testament to his power to inspire his men to keep going. Over the course of the grueling 8-year war, the colonial forces won few battles, but consistently held their own against the British. In October of 1781, with the aid of the French, who allied themselves with the colonists over their rivals, the British, the Continental forces were able to capture British troops under General Charles Cornwallis in the Battle of Yorktown. This action effectively ended the Revolutionary War, and George Washington was declared a national hero. So there you go. Just another little overview. Let me see what I can tell you here. Some fun facts. George Washington did not have a middle name. With a name like George Washington, you really don't need one. George Washington's birthday was not February 22nd of 1732. Washington was actually born on February 11th of 1731. But when the colonies switched to the Gregorian calendar from the Julian calendar, his birthday was moved 11 days. Since his birthday fell before the old date for New Year's Day, but after the new date for New Year's Day, his birth year was changed to 1732. It's pretty interesting, huh? Interestingly enough, at least. For a time, George Washington was a non-president commander-in-chief, but he didn't do much. In 1798, when fears were growing of a French invasion, actually, you know what? I'll get into that in part 2. I apologize. That's something that I would like to cover in part 2. Yeah, no, that's pretty much it on that one. Washington the Surveyor. Washington did not attend college. However, because he had an infinite affinity for math, he started his career in 1749 as a surveyor for the newly established Culpeper County in Virginia at the age of 17. A surveyor was one of the most important jobs for the new colonies. He was the one who mapped out the resources available in sections and set boundary lines for future potential ownership. He spent 3 years at this job before joining the British military, but he continued surveying throughout his life, eventually surveying an estimated total of 60,000 acres in 200 different surveys. His military action in the French and Indian War, we know that, in 1754 at the age of 21. Washington led the skirmish at Jumonville Glen and at the Battle of the Great Meadows, after which he surrendered to the French at Fort Necessity. It was the only time he surrendered to an enemy in battle. The losses contributed to the start of the French and Indian War, which took place from 1756 to 1763. During the war, Washington became aide-de-camp to General Edward Braddock. Braddock was killed during the war, and Washington was recognized for keeping calm and holding the unit together. Commander of the Continental Army, Washington was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolution, which he had military experience as part of the British Army. He had never led a large army in the field. He led a group of soldiers against a far superior army to victory, resulting in independence. In addition, Washington showed great foresight in inoculating his soldiers against smallpox. Although a president's military service is not a requirement for the job, Washington set a standard. He was president of the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention met in 1787 to deal with the weaknesses that had become apparent in the Articles of Confederation. Washington was reluctant to go. He was pessimistic about the future of a republic without a ruling elite. And at the age of 55, and after his extensive military career, he was ready to retire. James Madison Sr., the father of future U.S. 4th President James Madison, and General Henry Knox convinced Washington to go. And at the meeting, Washington was named the president of the convention and presided over the writing of the U.S. Constitution. What else is there? Just trying to see if there's anything else I would want to tell you regarding his early life. He only had a grade school education. The first president's formal schooling ended when he was 11 years old, this says, after his father died. That event cut young George off from the opportunity to be educated abroad in England, a privilege that had been afforded to his older half-brothers. Washington's mother never remarried, forcing the adolescent to shoulder weighty burdens at a young age. As the oldest child of 6 from his father's second family, she taught him how to run a tobacco farm, and at the age of 16, he took his first job as a land surveyor. For the rest of his life, Washington would be embarrassed by his stunted schooling. At the age of 22, Washington led a disastrous military skirmish that sparked a world war. As France and Britain fought for territory at the edges of the North American colonies, Virginia sided with the British. As an officer in the Virginia militia, Washington was sent out to the Ohio Valley, which is now western Pennsylvania, with some 150 troops to help repel any attacks by the French. Warned by local Native American allies that a small French force had set up camp within several miles of his position, he led an attack with 40 of his soldiers along with a dozen native warriors. Who fired the first shot remains in dispute, but at the end of the 15-minute skirmish, at least 10 French soldiers and 1 Virginian were dead, including, most notably, a minor French noble, Joseph Coulon de Villiers, Sieur de Drummondville, who the French later said was on a diplomatic mission. Drummondville's death enraged the French, who called Washington an assassin. The conflict between the French and British escalated into the French and Indian War, and soon spread worldwide in what became known as the 7 Years' War. Washington's first love was the wife of one of his best friends. The world has no business to know the object of my love, declared in this manner to you when I want to conceal it, Washington wrote weeks before his wedding. The letter wasn't sent to his fiancée, Martha Custis, but to Sally Fairfax, who was married to one of his best friends and patrons, George Fairfax, son of one of Virginia's largest landowners. Described as an intelligent, dark-eyed beauty, Sally befriended Washington when he was still an awkward teen. Historians credit her with helping to smooth his rough edges socially, teaching him how to behave and converse among the wealthy and powerful, and even how to dance the minuet. It's unclear whether romance actually blossomed between the two. So there you go. That's pretty much it. That's kind of a really vast, good overview of the early life, military career, and early political career of our first president, George Washington. That's going to lead us all the way up to his presidency, his legacy, his remaining time at Mount Vernon, his relationship in the issue of slavery, And we're going to get into all that. And then, of course, his death and his gravesite and burial site, the tomb there at Mount Vernon of George Washington. So we're going to get into all that in part 2. Thanks so much for joining, guys. Thank you for allowing us to do this revised edition of our George Washington video. I hope you enjoyed part 1. I know it was a bit long, but, you know, it's George Washington. Really, I probably should do 3 or 4 parts just on him alone, kind of like I did with Lincoln. But we're going to keep it just in 2 parts. Might be a little longer, but I promise well worth it. Stay tuned for some bonus footage. We have some really, really fun, cool bonus footage to show you guys in both parts. So I'm pretty sure there will be some in part 2 as well. But definitely here in part 1, there's plenty of bonus footage. So stay tuned for the bonus footage. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks so much, guys. Thank you for all the support. Thank you for everything. You guys are the best. Sincerely mean that, the best. We mean it, though. You guys are the best. Right, Henry?
Yep.
I had to come find Henry so he could say bye to you guys for this part 1. Thank you for letting us do this revised edition of George Washington, right?
Yep.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Next week, after we have this George Washington video series, next week, Henry and I are going to be doing a question and answers video for you guys. Maybe even with some bloopers at the end of it, right? Mm-hmm. Some funny bloopers, Henry?
Yep.
Oh, yeah. All right. Well, thanks, guys, and we'll see you tomorrow for part 2. Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.